This is the third video that I have filmed, the second one that I have edited, but if you are seeing this, it is the first one that I've actually posted. Hello, it's Allie, and I think it's about time that I catch you up on what I've been working on. Today I want to chat about finishing first drafts and starting the self-developmental editing process, specifically for those of you who are maybe not quite at the editing stage yet, or if you are but are kind of in the market for new ideas. I just kind of want to share what I have started doing and how it's worked for me so far in my own writing journey. I'm also going to briefly touch on what I've been up to personally since the last time we talked, so if that is not really your cup of tea and you want to get straight into the writing stuff, then no problem, just skip to the next chapter and I'll meet back up with you there. Okay, so as I mentioned in the intro, this is not my first attempt at a return to this channel and posting stuff on it. In fact, I've actually been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to get this channel up and running again, which you might have noticed the changed channel name, which, by the way, let me know your thoughts on that. I don't know, I went through a bit of a crisis, and so I changed the name. And I initially started to plan a bunch of stuff, like live streams and things. I got new equipment and all of that jazz. On the just regular video front, I have a ton of finished and half-finished scripts in my Google Docs for video ideas that I never made. And I even actually recorded and even edited a couple of videos back in the day that ultimately became unusable because the information in them was outdated. So why did those videos never get posted in the first place, and why did I not do all of those things like live streams and more videos like I was planning to do starting last summer? Well, a couple of things. So here is a speed run of all of the things that have been going on in my life since the last time that we talked. First, I got married, and I'm only now realizing as I have sat to record that I left my rings upstairs. Just imagine a ring on a finger. I was already married legally in 2020 to honor our original wedding date, but because of COVID, our actual ceremony that we had planned with, you know, like a venue and stuff like that, got pushed back to 2021. Our honeymoon was also derailed because of COVID. We were initially supposed to go to South Korea. I only bring all of this up because as I am filming this video, I'm actually preparing to go on my honeymoon now, like 3 years after I actually got married. We're finally going to be able to go on that initial trip to South Korea. So we're very excited about that. I'm gonna try to document as much of it as possible just for my own records and happiness, but if you would be interested in seeing any of that footage, then let me know. I've also changed jobs since the last time that we talked. I'm still in the same profession, but I did move to a new position at the start of 2022, so that's been exciting. I spent much of spring and summer of 2022 preparing to start making content again, in addition to just like writing and things. But that was when I like bought all this new equipment. I started making plans for like schedules and things like that. But right as things were starting to settle down and I thought I was going to be able to make good on all of those plans, life decided to unsettle itself right back up again. The upset in question was that my husband and I moved in kind of spontaneously in the middle of last summer. So in case you were wondering why the room looks different, it's because this is not the same house. But the craziness didn't end there, because while we sold our house in summer of last year, our new house was new construction and it wasn't going to be ready until the end of the year, namely like the end of September. So we ended up staying with my parents for a while because they live close by. And though I used to film videos right next door to my parents, after you live alone and do it by yourself, you just don't want to do that anymore. At least I don't want to do that anymore. Sorry, mom and dad. But so I was like, okay, well, I'll wait until I get into the new house. We get into the new house and there is no Wi-Fi and no network connection for at least a month. We didn't actually officially get to move into the house until near the end of the year, just because it was so bad. It was like a dead zone. Creating YouTube content aside, I work from home, so having Wi-Fi is kind of important to me. So I actually continued pretty much living at my parents' house for another month after we officially moved in. By the way, quick aside to say, please don't take this as me complaining about my first world problems, because I am, one, incredibly privileged to have a house, and two, incredibly privileged to have a loving family that lives close by to the point where I could live with them for an extended period of time, and they begged me to stay as long as I wanted. So I was fine. This was not a big deal to me, but it was kind of funny that It felt like the universe was giving me every single sign to not post any content in 2022. So anyway, after all that, I pretty much considered 2022 a wash as far as content went. However, it was not a wash for writing. In fact, 2022 is actually a pretty great year for my writing. If you skipped ahead, by the way, welcome back. You can rejoin us now. Starting the last time we spoke and leading up all the way until the end of 2021, I was still working on my work in progress DOS. I will probably talk more about this book and the tail end of 2021 at length in a different video, but for the sake of this video, let's just say that I realized that there were some parts of the pacing and world building that just felt so fundamentally broken that I needed to kind of wipe the slate clean and start again. Those broken pieces aren't irreparably broken, and it's not that I think that the book itself doesn't make sense or anything like that. It's just that there are certain elements that I think need a little bit more tweaking and a little bit more self-actualization until I am going to be confident enough to really put the meat on the bones of the book, so to speak. Even as I was recognizing those problems, I was also thinking of ways to solve them and ways that I think can and might work. However, I quickly felt as though I might be writing a loop that I had been for a while, where I would get to the point of the story where those problems reared their ugly heads, and instead of getting down to the root of the problem, I would restart the book over again and try fixing something in the beginning in hopes that it would fix the end, and it never did. Rather than continuing to just kind of brute force my way through this story, I ultimately decided that maybe I needed to get some more writing practice out in the trenches of working on other things and drafting new, fresh projects so that I could take whatever lessons I learned from working on those other things and then apply them to DOS at a later time. DOS is like my white whale, I swear. Like one day I think she's gonna be great, but today's not that day. Do y'all have stories like that? I mean, like, this must be a common thing, I feel like. Anyway, after I decided to take a break from DOS at the start of 2022, I started drafting on my newest work in progress, the one that I'm currently working on, which is called Kingfisher. And if you follow me on TikTok, you probably have seen me posting little, like, memes and things about this story on there. Kingfisher is currently an upper YA romance set in the fictional kingdom of Gothia. It is a dual POV with a female main character and a male main character, and the female main character is kind of a religious figure for the kingdom of Gothia. She's basically like this priestess chosen by the kingdom to represent the manifest destiny and divine right of their king. The male main character is the prince of a warring kingdom who has been sent to Gothia by his ailing father to try to broker a peace. They meet and there's chemistry, but there are a lot of chess pieces moving on the board in the Gothian court, and even when the two characters enter this kind of shaky alliance, there's always more to Gothia and its people than meets the eye. So I started drafting that in February of 2021, and then I worked on it for the first session of Camp NaNoWriMo that year in April, and I managed to finish the first draft with about 100,000 words right before Christmas. In the past, I have always finished a first draft of something and then I will put it aside and first draft something else, with the intention of, after I first draft that other thing, I will come back and edit something else. So initially, after I finished this first draft, I was torn between two things. I was like, well, do I feel ready to go back to DOS yet? Not really. So I'm not gonna work on that. So maybe I'll start drafting something else. And I have a ton of documents full of plot outlines and story ideas and stuff. So I kind of spent the last couple weeks of 2022 and the first week or so of 2023 just kind of going back over all of those things and perusing my different projects and thinking to myself, okay, like what thing is sparking joy? Like what do I want to work on right now? And frankly, nothing was. The only thing that I kept thinking about was wanting to get started on the rewrites for Kingfisher. So even though I've always heard that it's good to take some time away from a project before you come back into edits, I did feel as though taking off those like 3 to 4 weeks from the end of 2022 into the start of 2023 was enough to let the story kind of percolate to the point where I could feasibly start the second draft. However, I have learned the error of my ways with DOS, and so I was not about to just start the second draft immediately. When I say that I started the second draft, I mean that I started preparing for the second draft at the start of 2023. I I'm just now starting the official like chapter by chapter rewrite of the book now in March, but for January and February, I spent those months doing some prep work that I'm now going to share with you. So the first thing that I did was try something that I've seen a lot of other authors do, but never personally felt like my book was ready to do. Right after I finished the full first draft of Kingfisher, I did what I've seen some other authors do and got the entire thing printed out from Staples. So there's that. Can you see it? It's very thick. She's very full and chunky. We'll get into these note cards later. The process of getting this printed, by the way, was super easy, so let me just quickly tell you in case this is something you've considered yourself. I use Scrivener, and that made it super duper easy. I don't know how easy it would be via Word documents or things like that, but if you have everything on Scrivener like I do, just make sure that you have your project laid out the way that you like. For me, I have different parts and sections in my book, so I have it split into parts and then individual chapters and then individual scenes. And so as long as you have that laid out the way that you like within the manuscript section, all you have to do is go to File, Compile, and then Manuscript Courier. There's also Manuscript Times in there, but Courier is just the font, which makes it look like this. Like that. Sorry. Oh my god, I'm a mess. Hold on. Oh god, okay. I prefer using Courier because it's more like a traditional manuscript printout, but to each their own. So I did mine that way. And like I said, I used Staples. So if you want to do the same, if you have a Staples near you, they also just ship it to you. I had mine shipped to me, but you can do store pickup in some cases too. And in that case, if you do want to go through Staples, like you want to sponsor me, you just go to their website and then go to services and then printing and marketing services and then document printing. And from there, they have a couple of different options. I think I just went with the simple document printing option and then I added a couple of add-ons and upgrades from there. In my case specifically, I upgraded the paper so that it would be thick enough that no like Sharpies or markers would bleed through, though in retrospect, doing so probably made the paper too thick to the point where I could have just had the whole thing printed double-sided, because right now it is like a thick, chunky mammoth. Like she's big, and this could have been half the size if I got it printed double-sided. So that's maybe something to consider, or don't worry too much about upgrading the paper so much, though you might want to leave it at least at standard, like don't go super thin. I also selected the upgrade to have it pre-hole punched and bound in that binder. The little cover thing is just something I made on Canva for fun, but it just came in the plain black binder. All in all, the entire thing cost me about $100, a little bit more than $100 with those upgrades included. Like I said, some of those upgrades probably weren't necessary, though I would highly recommend getting it bound in a binder if you're like me, because while I know some people like to have everything split up and separated, I much prefer everything to be in one place. So that would be the one upgrade I would really recommend, is getting it pre-hole punched and paying for the additional binder. It's not that much more expensive. I also just highly recommend getting your draft printed out in general if you feel like your draft is worthy of it. I struggle to find another word, but basically, you know, in my case, I've had other first drafts before, but they have all felt so fundamentally incomplete in some way that I felt they were more of a zero draft than a first draft. This book, Kingfisher, was the first time that I was like, this is a bad book, but it is a book. And so I felt like it made sense to have it all printed out so that I could then read it like a book. Because when I hear about authors saying that this is how they start their editing process, by printing everything out and reading it chapter by chapter, the reason why I never did that is because I was like, well, I already know it's bad and I already know I'm not gonna like it, so it doesn't even really feel like a book to me at that point. And this is the first time I was like, actually, yeah, like I think that would make sense. If you are somebody who struggles not to edit as you go or to edit yourself as you go back through rereads, then I highly recommend this for you, because it really does force you into a different kind of mindset. I've done some beta reading and developmental editing work before, so it reminded me much more of putting that part of my brain at the forefront and putting the author side of me way in the back. This forces you to flip your perspective and I think that can really help in some instances. So once I got my printed brick in the mail, I went through and I read the entire thing start to finish. I've heard people say that they try to read it within 1 to 2 sessions. I really just read as much as I felt like reading at that point in my day, and so it ultimately took me about a week to read because I was trying to be more mindful of it than I usually am when I just read a book for fun. Lots of people have different kind of methodologies for this, but I really just went into it kind of deciding to do whatever I felt was right in the moment. So here's the organization tactic that I ended up going with. I try to keep it simple with just a couple of sets of post-it notes, a highlighter, and a pen. And basically all I did was highlight any particular lines or scenes that I really liked, especially in instances where I knew that scene was ultimately going to go away. If there was something that I wanted to maintain and I wanted to keep that line and save it for later, I wanted to make sure to highlight it. And then with the pen, I went through and made just some kind of inline comments, very surface level things of just like, this is good, or this is stiff and I don't like this, you know, trying to keep my developmental editor brain on. And then anytime I would have put a actual comment in a document, instead I pulled out a thing of sticky notes and I would write my longer form comments on there. And what I ended up doing as a way to mark each chapter is I took a different sticky note set and put those at the start of every chapter. And rather than just using them as tabs and bookmarks, I instead used them as something that I called broad strokes. And basically at the end of reading each chapter, I would go back to that tab at the front of the chapter and just write my general thoughts on the chapter as a whole, because I wanted to see not just how it fit into the overall story, but how well that chapter was actually doing what I needed it to do, and if it wasn't, then I probably recommended that I scrap it. Basically, I just did a modified version of the kind of annotations that you do in high school, so if you've done those before, you can absolutely do this. If I were to go back and change anything, I probably would have gone into those parts, like I mentioned before, which are basically just the act separations, and I would have done a similar thing, taking a long series of notes on how that part was doing as its own segment of the story, because I ultimately came to some revelations later about that I think I would have come to earlier had I done it that way, but ultimately I'm happy with the way that I did it. So after the initial read through, I definitely did not feel prepared enough to take on the second draft already, so instead I busted out my next attempt at an editing strategy, note cards. One of the things that I noticed in my read through was that there were entire scenes that I kept feeling like were in the wrong place. They needed to be moved around. And frankly, I was really attuned to that because I was expecting it. Because the book is dual POV and it was my first real attempt at writing a full book that was split between 2 main characters, I went into the first draft not really sure how I wanted to separate the 2 different perspectives. There are definitely strategies for that, and I did look into some, but frankly, I realized that as the first draft and my first brush into the first draft, I wasn't going to know the best way to utilize those strategies yet. And so instead, I decided to keep to a rather strict structure of 1 character per chapter alternating every chapter. So just a bland flip-flop, which can work really well, but in my case, I already knew as I was drafting that I was probably not going to end up using that same structure just due to the way that some of the plot events happen in the book. The reason that I forced myself to do this, even knowing that it probably wasn't going to stay that way in later drafts, was that I was more worried that not having familiarization with dual POV stories and writing them, that I was going to ultimately give 1 character too much page time versus the other, or that 1 character's personal character arc would fall by the wayside because I would get more excited by another character's plot events and things like that. So ultimately, I was more worried about having any of those things happen and not being able to catch them as easily in edits than I was about what ended up happening, which is realizing that some scenes needed to be rearranged and that I was going to need to do some jigsaw puzzle piecing together. This also applies, of course, to scenes where both main characters are present in the same scene, and ultimately I decided that it's going to be written from the other character's perspective. I'm capable of doing that, I'm not too worried about doing that, so I felt it was the safer option, at least for this first experience. Hence, the note cards. And this is another thing that I chose to keep very simple. So if you've been on kind of the writing and editing side of of the internet, then you probably have seen the way that some people use their note cards, and a lot of them are very involved and they're very purposeful and specific, and they fire on a lot of different cylinders. Like, they're trying to do a lot of things for the author. And frankly, I tried that and I got so burnt out just after like writing 1 or 2 note cards at a time that I realized I needed to keep it simple, because like I said, I knew so many things were going to get switched around, and I knew that so much had to be restructured and the plot events were going to be moved around in the overall plot arc. And so I was like, why am I going to waste my time really deeply diving into each granular scene when that scene is going to change so fundamentally as soon as I start writing? For my purposes, those more involved note cards are probably something I'm more likely to do between a second and third draft than a first and a second draft. So I did the opposite. I kept everything very simple. For each note card, I pretty much wrote like a 1 to 2 line description of what happens, literally like 1 line. And I basically just wrote a very simple and purposefully vague description of the actual plot action of what happens in that scene. I then laid out all of these note cards on the floor in accordance with where they fell in the kind of 4-act plot structure that I had used. It's just a 3-act structure, but the second act is split into 2. And once that was done, I basically just started moving those babies around like I was a grown man shuffling colors to intense background music. And this, by the way, is why I mentioned that in my initial read through, I might have liked taking notes on each separate part as well, because when I laid out these note cards the way that they were in the original story, I realized that my acts were a little bit unbalanced as far as the plot. Specifically, the second half of Act 2 was way shorter than any of the other acts, and by comparison, the first half of Act 2 was kind of bloated and had way too much stuff going on. And in my initial read through, I had even mentioned that some of those scenes that happened in Act 2 Part 1 needed to be moved to later in the story. So I was like, if I had just taken those notes at the time, I probably would have noticed that sooner, but I got there eventually with the note cards. So with my new arrangement of note cards and scenes, I still didn't feel ready to start draft 2 yet. These note cards only took me like 10 minutes to swap around, partly because I already knew where some stuff was going to go, and the read through had really helped me keep fresh in my mind what each scene was about, so I really was able to just kind of be like, puzzle piece, you know? The note cards, while a very essential part of this whole process, ultimately was the one that took the least amount of time, and so I spent most of February making a new, updated outline of the story. To be clear, I don't consider 1-line descriptions of what happens in the story as an outline. For me, outlining is a little bit more involved, and I'll kind of briefly explain what I mean. I approach this pretty much identical to the way that I approach drafting, so this is how I usually do that. I start by making a bullet pointed list. Each bullet point doesn't really represent anything in particular. It can either be a scene, a chapter, a plot beat, whatever. Really, I just kind of go by feel. Whenever I feel like the next bullet point needs to happen, it does. And usually that ends up kind of giving me a general structure of the big things that are going to happen in the story. If 2 big things happen in the course of 1 scene, that's fine. They're still getting 2 separate bullet points. If 1 chapter only really does 1 main thing for the plot, that entire chapter is going to end up being 1 bullet point. So I basically do that, just telling myself the story, writing it all out to myself, point by point, and then only after that do I go through and apply some plot structure elements to that. I have another video drafted on the way that I use plot structure in my books, which we will talk about later, but for the purposes of this video, suffice it to say that I don't actually use any one particular plot structure. Rather, I use like 5 of them, and I just kind of take the greatest hits, the things that I really like and that I think are really valuable and important to have, especially the ones that I might forget about otherwise. This is always my favorite part of the outlining process because it comes the easiest to me. Like, telling myself a story is probably the easiest part of the entire process of writing a book, but it was even more fun this time around because from an editing perspective, I wasn't just pulling everything out of my own head. I also had the original story to base things off of and the insights of my read through, so all of those ideas that I already had like stacked up, and the new basic outline that I had from my note cards. So it made things a lot easier and also a lot harder in other instances, but in a fun way. Like, getting to weave together all of the different elements to make sure that things fit ultimately meant that everything else got tweaked a little bit, where some of the note cards that I had switched around, ultimately I switched back because I no longer liked it in context of the more subtle elements of the story. And that's why I wanted to do a more fleshed out outline, because in my bigger outlines I do pay closer attention to the nuance of things and the flow of things, and if it just sounds good. So something that looks good on paper isn't necessarily going to transfer when you start considering all of the other things that are going to happen. So I had in my note cards that I needed to give some extra scenes to certain characters, and then when I put it in context, I was like, nobody wants to hear from this character right now. Like, we are much more invested in what's happening to this other character. So things like that happen, and that's why I like having the big outline. If you take one thing away from editing or drafting your stuff at all, it's to outline, and to remember that outlining doesn't have to mean taking a template from a plot structure and just adhering everything to it. You can just tell yourself a story and think about what you want your story to be about and where you want certain things to develop, and that might be enough for you just by itself. So there's my advice to you. But that, my friends, brings us to now. So I have officially started on draft 2. So far, I only have written really the first chapter. For now, I have copied the original manuscript into the notes section of my Scrivener file, and I'm kind of slowly, chapter by chapter, replacing the original text in the actual manuscript section with the new writing. I'm not sure that I love that setup. It feels a little bit messy to me, but I do like that doing it that way allows me to use the split screen feature, so I can see the old chapter and the new chapter side by side. So I don't know. If I come up with a better idea, I'll let you know. If you have a better idea, let me know. But now, my friends, you are all caught up. I'm fully in rewrites now, which is about as fun as it is daunting. Oh, I'm out of battery. Are we okay? We're back. If there is a slight change to the angle, no, there's not. I'm at like the end of the video too. Like, she could have just held on for like 5 more minutes. Anyway, drafting and editing really are two different beasts, and editing this book has really confirmed for me a lot of my suspicions when I was working on DOS. So I think I also succeeded in doing what I set out to do by not working on DOS this past year. In fact, working on the edits for this has really made me wonder if I might just go back the next time I work on DOS and kind of scrap the entire thing and recycle it, rather. Not scrap, recycle. And really just start from page 1 and try again and see if I can't get a good, solid first draft out of that story. Maybe there's a lesson in there somewhere, but that's a topic for another day. This video is long enough already. Not entirely sure when I'm going to be back on this channel, considering the fact that I am going to Korea in a couple weeks, but I do have some exciting stuff in the works that I will get to as soon as I can. In the meantime, I would really appreciate it if you would like this video and make sure you're subscribed with the notifications turned on so that you get notified every time I do post a video to this channel. If you want to hear from me more or see me make stupid little memes about writing and my work in progress, then TikTok is probably the place to follow me, though I am trying to post on Instagram more as well, so either of those places, my links are in the description. Thank you so much as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! I just want you to be aware that my camera overheated 5 times in the course of me filming this video. I think it only took me an hour to film, maybe an hour and a half, but here we are. Most of that time was spent with me sitting scrolling through TikTok on my phone because my camera was overheating. So I like this camera, but she's a bit fragile. We love her, okay? We love her. Anyway, goodbye.